the bulk of them would be found clustered around Citadel Hill.
Yeah, let's talk about Citadel Hill. That is an interesting story, and since it is the focal point of our city, for listeners all around who are tuning in via the internet or otherwise, let's talk about Citadel Hill. What's the story on the clock building in particular? Is that something you covered in the book?
Well, I know a bit about the story there, about the clock building itself. I didn't put that in the book because there's books out there about the Citadel ghost. So I wanted to.
Right.
I hit upon one main story that I really enjoyed because I had to have the Citadel in there. I wasn't going to ignore it. I didn't want to, basically rip out, all the stories from somebody else's collection and say, oh yeah, jam these in here too.
Okay. Well, let's focus on your book then. We don't want to do that. Let's focus on your story about the Citadel. What can you share with us about that?
Well, the thing about the Citadel, Halifax being by the sea, we got the whole fishermen, men of the deep sort of context there. Sailors are superstitious, fishermen are superstitious, and sailors and fishermen's wives are deeply superstitious because their fellows are going to go off to sea and they might not come back.
Mm-hmm.
So they learn to make friends with that whole concept of the afterlife, and they tell ghost stories, Soldiers are just as bad because they might go off to a battle and get a cannonball take off their head, sort of thing.
Right.
So they're very superstitious, and their wives are very superstitious. So when you throw a big old fort like Citadel Hill into the middle of a harbor town, harbor city like Halifax, that's a double dose of supernaturalism right there. So there's bound to be ghost stories that grow there, just like mold in the basement, sort of thing.
Exactly.
So the story I tell is the story. A lot of people have heard bits of it. It's the fellow who haunts the well there, and it's all based on history and truth. They actually there was a big fire, and after the fire, the water started tasting bad in this well. They've got two wells in the Citadel, that go deep into the earth, sort of thing. And these two wells, one of them started tasting really badly. And about a year later, they found out why it started tasting really badly, because when they went to pull up the rope or the chain, there was an arm tangled around it.
Wow.
And they dredged it down the bottom, and they found this soldier's body down there. It was this sergeant that had disappeared around the time of the fire. Now, certain history books say that there never was a fire, and other history books say there was a fire, and then that's where the mystery takes over, because I always tell people the history is a great part is hearsay.
Right.
Now, it's just because it gets written down in certain books doesn't always mean. Sooner or later, it comes down to the writer of these certain books talked to somebody, and he said, "This is the way it happened."
Well, this is fast.
Always writing down history, stories when you write history. So.
Right.
I apologize. I rambled a bit on that one.
No, that's great. I'm just glad to have you here. You're actually our first guest on the Unified Field, Steve. So congratulations.
I know that. Yeah, I knew this was a show just starting up when you'd contacted me. You said I'm doing this new show, and but I did not realize I was to be. This is an honor.
Well, you're going down in the history books, my friend.
Wow.
So you know what? I have to mention Halifax Haunts and Haunted Harbors. Excuse me. There's a fascinating angle here for me when I look at these stories, because it must have been incredibly interesting to meet with some of these people that you included in the book, who told the stories, who recounted some of these spooky spaces and old ghost stories. Was that the case for you?
Well, that's the thing about storytelling, is people tell you stories,
Mm-hmm.
I go around to different places and I'll tell a bunch of stories, and there's always somebody who'll come up to me at the end and say, "You ought to hear this one." Now, a lot of times they'll tell me something and it'll be just sort of the usual, the thing that your uncle will tell you, sort of thing. But I get some incredible stories told to me. And then I say, "Can I retell this?" And they say, "Oh, sure, that's what it's for, pass it around." So, yeah, you're just meeting and hearing from the people. In the Haunted Harbors, there's one there that Big Tony and the Moose, I think I call it. And I got that from a fella who was driving me home from a Shelburne school trip. As I go to the different schools, I've been working through the writers in the schools since 1998. That's why I have an ability to relate to kids, because I work with them closely.
Right.
So it's people that you meet who tell you the stories.
Yeah, I think the people of this end of the country, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, are some of the most interesting people you'll meet. They have a really rich, deep, and historical background, and they're always so very welcoming. Good, pleasant people, as long as you get on the level and get your hands dirty. I have to get into Wicked Woods because I don't want to keep you all day long here. What's your fantastic story from Old New Brunswick from your book Wicked Woods?
Well, Wicked Woods was my second collection. And I always tell people that with the second book, I finally figured out how to do it. My writing was a lot stronger. My storytelling voice was a lot stronger. The stories in Wicked Woods are a little deeper and a little darker. There's some of them in there, particularly the one I'm thinking of, Ghost Hill, I think was called.
Okay.
With the fellow who cut up the horse. It's a very dark, eerie story. It almost leans into the territory of horror stories. So Wicked Woods is a deeper, thicker, it's a larger book. It's a larger collection.
Can we just briefly talk about that story? Can you give a quick synopsis of what happened there? Because it sounds pretty eerie.
Wow.
Is it a large story?
It's not so much a large. Here, I'm just pulling it off the bookshelf here.
Sure.
Because it's not one I tell regularly because it's a little too dark to tell in schools.
Okay.
So I don't have the details fresh in my memory here.
Mm-hmm.
No. If you need a New Brunswick story, I think you need to look no further than the Dungarvan Whooper.
Let's talk about it.
Well, the Dungarvan Whooper, the Dungarvan area was a great logging area, and back there, basically, people would lumberjacks would go off into the woods, and they'd stay there, for a whole season at a time. Usually, they'd do it in the winter because the winter the leaves were all gone. It was easier to see where the trees were. They fell sharper because the wood would be frozen. So you'd hack and you'd take a great big old platter-sized chunk out of the wood, sort of thing. So they do it, mostly through the winter. And it seems in this one lumberjack camp, there was a young fellow who was a cook, and he was saving his money. Every cent he earned, he saved, tucked it in the money belt, because he was sweet on this girl in town, and he was going to marry her just as soon as he could get a whole pot full of money. But the camp boss, he kept watching this guy's money belt. The way I put it, he watched the guy's belly.
Right.
As the money belt swelled, the guy's belly got a little bigger, and the camp boss, he got a little hungry for what was in that money belt. So
right.
One day he sent the fellows off. He said, "You go off in the firewoods." He says, "There's tall trees out there." And he said, "I want to hear you chopping." He says, "The Dungarvan woods should never grow quiet. I want to hear them chopping." Basically, he's sending the witnesses off. Because he said, the one fella I want to stay behind can't cook. He has to stay behind because he's a cook.
Right.
So, when the guys got back that night, the cook was lying dead on the floor.
Okay.
Take this fella out and bury him, And everybody noticed the money belt was gone, so it wasn't too hard to figure out. But the guy's the boss, so you're not going to rat out the boss because he'll get you fired.
Wow.
Was that.
Wow.
So they took him out into the woods, and they went to dig his grave, and there was this great whooping that come out in the woods, this great whooping sound, and it struck the boss dead.
Wow.
I'm shortening this a lot because I don't want to, tie up your airwaves here, but it struck him dead, and they said ever since then, they hear this great whooping sound in the woods.
Hold on a second.
Regular basis.
Now, hold on a second. Let's tie up the airwaves here. What are you saying here? A whooping sound? Something attacked the boss?
Well, this is the way they say it happened. They dug the grave, and they laid him down, and there was this great whoop, so loud that it shook the boss right down to his knees.
Wow.
Everybody said, what the heck was that? Actually it said, what the hell, but this is on the airwaves, so we're going to not swear.
This is our radio station. Let's make it dramatic.
So they said, what the heck happened? And he fell to his knees.